Hello and welcome to this week's, or this month's rather, Practice as Research seminar. I'm really excited as always. I mean, it's quite surprising how quickly time flies. It feels like yesterday that we had a presentation by Elsa Ermsden. But no, it's already the next month. So today we have got with us Dr. Suzy Tutchell. It's Dr. Suzy Tutchell, who is going to be talking about stitches of self, restorative textile-based approaches to define the lived experience. I've had the pleasure of hearing Suzy's presentation earlier this academic year, and because of that, I basically asked her if she would be prepared to talk to us today and to give us an opportunity to ask some questions about, that kind of space where we're doing practice as research. Dr. Suzy Tutchell is Associate Professor in Art Education at the Institute of Education, University of Reading. And as an artist, researcher, teacher, she explores diverse sensory and creative methods at the intersection of art and social justice. Suzy leads the arts specialism on the BA Primary Education programme and the creativity pathway on the Masters in Education, whilst also serving as school director for racial equity and justice. With a background as an art subject leader and consultant in London schools, she brings over 15 years' experience in higher education to her work in shaping inclusive and imaginative practices in education. So without further ado, and rather excitedly, I'm going to hand over to Suzy. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can begin sharing yours. And after the presentation, we've obviously got, as always, an opportunity to discuss. If you would like to have me ask the questions on your behalf, please feel free to use the chat box. Suzy, you can totally ignore the chat function. I will do that on your behalf, so you don't have to look at that at all. But obviously, I'm hoping that we get quite an interactive way of talking to one another, so that actually Suzy will hear your voices directly. So, handing over to you.
Can you see my screen and you've got the right thing on there, not my notes? Yeah.
No, all good.
I'm terribly sorry because I'm not used to using Zoom anymore. I'm such a Teams person, so I might have to fiddle around in between my two screens, but hopefully it'll all make sense to you. And I'm looking at my other screen while I'm speaking. Anyway, it's lovely to be here. I'm Suzy and I work at the Institute of Education at the University of Reading, as Nicole said. Thank you so much, Nicole, for inviting me to be a part of these lunchtime seminars, which I didn't know about. So now I'm really happy I do. And I'm really pleased to be able to discuss an aspect of my research work with all of you today. So as Nicole said, I teach across a range of programmes from undergraduate to PGCE, Masters and PGR supervision. I'm sure that's familiar to anyone else who works in HE. We have a lot of hats, not always by choice. And so I have to hold on to what is most important for me professionally and personally amidst a very busy academic year. So art, learning, lived experiences, my students, research-informed pedagogies are all that is important. And on that note, I wanted to tell you about a particular research project that's been going really for the last 18 months that recognises those important things, and it's called Stitches of Self. It's part of a much wider project with creative research methods at the heart of my practice. So right back to when I was a primary school teacher and a subject lead for art in inner city London schools, which is now a very long time ago. I've always been interested and committed to how we can adapt our teaching, our learning, our encounters to people, lived experiences and individual circumstances through the lens of art. So expressions and emotions that are prompted by the power of our sensory encounters has always felt inclusive and enables this wonderful sense of how our bodies, our vitality and our minds are fully alive in the moment. I use materials all the time to help tell stories, and I use that with my students and my participants, research participants I work with. I think it helps to take the onus of words away from us for a little while and time to engage somatically with our thoughts and our memories, our hands, our eyes, our ears, etc. So actually, to get you in the mood for somatic engagement, I'm doing just a little tiny warm up. I ask my students often to tell me the story of something, their weekend, their module, the journey on their module, something that's happened to them, their morning, and they tell that journey through a wire or a pipe cleaner, whatever it may be. So I thought, and it helps. I guess it's a very simple method, if you like, an evaluative tool for them to help enable that review of peaks and troughs of life. And as we're online, I can't give you a wire or a pipe cleaner. So feel free to take a pen or something to make a mark with. Just tell the story of your week so far. As I always say to the people I'm working with, there's no right or wrong to this. The only slightly worrying thing is if your line just stays like that, because that means you've flatlined, and I'm sure you've had a lot of experiences so far. Anyway, it's just to really get you in the mood for thinking about how we visually and haptically convey experiences without the word, without verbal word or written word. Do feel free to continue your doodled week while I continue with the presentation. So just to really, I wanted to contextually situate my research. I just wanted to briefly consider how creative thinking can be useful in overcoming language blocks. It's a skill, I guess, that allows a learner or a teacher to investigate new ways of looking at and solving individual learning problems. There's an article called Metaphors, Puns and Chance Combination, Creative Thinking Strategies and Art Practice by Jean Nemeth, who lists these qualities that you see here of creative thinking. So this idea of understanding, sorry, I've lost where I am. I'm sorry, fluency, generating many ideas, and flexibility, changing perspective, originality, that conceiving of something novel, elaboration, so that embellishing and expanding on our ideas and others' ideas. And then the other qualities are really self-evident, but equally important, particularly for me, that sense of curiosity, which I think is the search engine for all our knowledge building. And they're transferable life skills, I think, that allow for divergent thinking that moves in expansive ways in different directions to incorporate a variety of views. And that's very much versus that convergent thinking that relies on logic and analytical skills to produce one correct answer. And in the field of education, particularly ITE education, so initial teacher education, that convergent thinking for me happens too often. And I really want to develop the way the people I work with and the students I work with, I want them to think about being divergent, of being brave, taking risks and using their curiosity. I'm going to tell you the story of Stitches of Self kind of with a backstory. It's a backstory in two parts and really how the research came about. I have been involved in other work where I mentor artists who are seeking refugee status. So I do a lot of work really with people who have experienced forced migration. It's something I feel strongly about and I have family experience of. I also work with an Oxford-based charity, Asylum Welcome, as a schools advocacy mentor, and as illustrated in these pictures as an art workshop facilitator with a women's refugee group. So I do have some understanding of approaches and working alongside those who've experienced and are experiencing extreme trauma due to a displacement. What I know from listening to these voices and my own training that I've been a part of and the research I do is that they're not just a collective, you know, as it were. So for the women's group in particular that I work with, it's that importance of disentangling from assumptions that society can make about their identities, past and present, and often accidentally, but that was key to when I worked with this group. Their identity in the new country is different from who they were and still are. And it's not just about their migratory status. They're so often having to tell stories for applications, and so very scripted stories. And I really wanted to enable them to go beyond that and kind of value who they really are, so that they were telling stories that were non-linear, that acknowledged that sense of ongoingness and disruption that they had been a part of. And we told this through textiles, felt making, and story sticks. They were very powerful and beautiful work that was produced. So then the second part, backstory, if you like, is working with my university students. So at the University of Reading, we have somehow managed, against all odds, to retain an art specialism route on our BA Primary Education course, where students are training to be teachers. And these students will aspire to become art subject leads in primary schools when they enter the teaching profession. So as part of their studies, they have time in the art studios to develop projects, such as working with different types of artists, and they are artists themselves. They're researchers and prospective teachers. So they really develop that understanding of artography, of the artist, teacher, researcher identity, if you like. They map rivers of life of their art experiences. They use art to define, for example, what gender means to them and their identity within that, and create textile pieces to discuss, for example, the importance of community. Because what happens so often on these courses is that they are part of a somewhat automaton culture, a culture that depends a lot on standardization, government guidance, Ofsted guidance, lots of timetabled subject teaching. And I think what often happens on these ITE courses is that their self-narration is ignored or undervalued. So this has been a large part of my research, and it was part of my doctoral research as well. So we look at stories of identity, how their presence and vitality can be really a part of their studies, where the student is seen and not just the trainee teacher. So, where we kind of magnify interpersonal and subjective relevance. So although, those two backstories are working with two very different groups, there were some commonalities, and obviously different people, different circumstances, but some really important commonalities where we were listening to and valuing individuality, and that really important temporal sense of who we are, our past, our present, our future, and how that all comes together to tell our stories. The important sense of belonging and voice as these participants were as a group, individually, working with me within the space that they occupied, and also my social and educational responsibility of working with them. As I said, that importance of providing a safe space, that was a really key to both groups of people I was working with. And with this hope, not just my hope, but their hope, that sense of hope and anticipation that could ripple into the future for both sets of participants. So the current story, which is what all that research led me to, it's the current story and last year's story. And in many ways, what I'm presenting today is about the exploration of the methodology. So the current story is Stitches of Self. It was a year-long inclusive textile-based research project exploring how somatic, sensory and non-verbal creative practices grounded in theories of embodiment and empathy could support individuals in expressing stories of resilience and identity. Lots of words involved in the title of that project. But you can see what I've highlighted in purple with the key parts, really, that we were working with textiles. We wanted it to be an exploration of the somatic, sensory and non-verbal powers of the textile-based approach, so that people could express their stories of resilience and identity. And We worked over the course of the year with our teacher education students and other students that should have been involved in this wording, and to have the project, which was in a safe, listening friendly space where art-based approaches enabled meaningful expression, disclosure and shared understandings. And the evolving aims of the research really were around this understanding of restorative creativity. So how we could use textiles as an embodied medium for expression to safely, that word was really important all the way through, that sort of safe premise to explore narratives between the verbal and non-verbal and the unsaid. And a note on education and social impact. The aim was to consider sensory haptic research methods that could help give volume to voices, help to amplify voices, and also nurture an empathetic listening from all involved. It wasn't a response to need. It was in that response to change that automaton culture and to accommodate people's experiences, the complexities of trauma, of transition and resilience, but again, through an empathetic and educational response. And actually this last aim was about collaboration in safe spaces, to explore safe spaces where dignity, hope and kindness were central. And that is in many ways reflective of Refugee Education UK, which I've had the pleasure of working with quite closely. And really their main drive is about dignity, hope and kindness being central to the way we educate. So we wanted to focus on textiles. We saw it as an empathetic embodied medium. And actually this quote comes from a rather amazing exhibition that was at the Barbican 2 years ago, which was called The Subversive Stitch. And it was all about using textiles and fabrics as political activism. And I thought that somehow this quote here, to harness a medium through which to speak powerfully about intimate everyday stories, just spoke to this research that I was working with. And the pilot of this research happened at the same time as this exhibition. So it all kind of had a lovely synergy about it. So we focus on textiles. We really do believe that we believed and we hoped that textiles would think about how we use our hands and movement to explore and experiment in a kind of non-conventional way. And that the power of the materiality of the object, so that it kind of enabled embodied forms of empathy and transformation in a subjective and embodied way while looking at each other. So you've got sort of a whole gallery of action going on, of using materials where we're watching each other, listening to each other, all part of the artifact material that we're working with. And the fact that when we're working with a medium like textiles, it can speak very powerfully about intimate everyday stories, as that quote said, because you're working with things where your body's involved and it makes changes to something. And somehow that communication between our hands and our mind helps with the forms of empathy that we're working with. So all very wrapped up, if you like, raveled up within the textiles. We adopted an empathetic and embodied theoretical approach. We understood and understand empathy as a moral imagination. We believe it included a cognitive dimension to it, so where we understand each other's, where we feel with those people we're working with and for ourselves, and a responsive dimension where we truly listen. We also believe that actually for embodied theory within this study, the focus was also on sensory imagination. So we were connecting through the body, that kind of real importance of somatic engagement. Again, effectiveness, but through conscious effectiveness and a spatial relational connection. And together we hoped that empathy and embodiment would extend our imagination so we could more fully grasp the lived worlds of others in a really as a human possibility, a real human possibility, as Green spoke about a good, I can't do my maths, 30 odd years ago, but still resonates with this project. So we worked with these very simple story sticks, a kind of part of our methodology, really, within a safe space. We use story sticks as our narrative tool, thinking about coloured wool, the thread, the yarn, colours, length, size, textures chosen by our participants to tell their tales and moments and emotions and disclosures. We felt it was participatory because it combined individual reflection with social interaction. It was sensory, not only through the visual and tactile, but also through the symbolic and aesthetic, meaning that objects, gestures and forms can carry deeper layers of meaning, and their beauty and design somehow help to engage both imagination and emotion. And it's performative, working through the body with somatic awareness, those circular rhythms of actually wrapping the sticks, and that iterative process that allowed learning and transformation to unfold, but quite gradually. And in this way, I think we felt that we were offering a participatory, sensory, performative methodology that was a lived method of empathy and imagination in action. So just a little bit really about, I guess, our ethical stance. Keane, as you can see from this quote, talks about a triangulated empathetic bond of the material, the researcher and the participants. And I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it, because there was this kind of relationship between all these three aspects which helped when verbal expression is limited by emotional states or trauma or mistrust or just language barriers. So I like to think of it in this sort of circular but triangular empathetic bond. And then extending that into this idea of the reflexive ethical circle, we talked about how such an approach begins with the body, that your eyes and hands do the talking and the voice follows. And that understanding that embodied knowing can often mean gesture, touch and attentiveness that can precede the actual words. Textiles, as Penka suggests here, notes this idea of carrying that reverberation. So materials that carry that kind of reverberation that allows for the vibrating of histories and possibility. And it attends to an acknowledgement of subjectivities of objects and their role in meaning making. It's very dialogical and illustrative. So, you know, what unfolds between people, material and spaces, forming that circular sense of unity and care, where each contribution returns back to the process. We feel it was, you know, this ethical response that, as Head and Cower suggests, is intrinsic to that relational activity, and that care arises through being with and kind of listening bodily, resonating with materials and recognizing the agency of others. So we worked with, in this first year of Stitches, we worked with a range of students, far and wide and across programs as well. As I said before, it was much more about kind of testing out the methods really in order to develop more focused research projects into this year and beyond. That was very much our hope. As you can see here, it's different groups worked with story sticks and felt making to tell stories. It's a gallery of production that you're looking at here, and actually they're wide and varied quotes, and the data of that was produced is hard to kind of gather. What you've got here are stories of the students' years. stories of transition, of modules, of their teenage years, and of teaching placements. It's a small snippet across the participant groups, but it gives you a flavour. And the colours they chose depict particular moments, experiences, and memories, some more difficult than others. So, for instance, here you had a doctoral student who is a music secondary teacher and is trying to hold on to the value of music as part of her doctoral research. So she said the red is shouting, is the constant shouting from me that music matters. This was from a master's student from the Ukraine who was reflecting her year on the master's degree and how it related really to what she was feeling about her family at home. And she talked about how whites might always hope that peace comes to my country. The same group of students, the master's students, when these sticks were produced and they were laid out on the table, two had been joined together, and it turned out that two of the students had fallen in love during the master's module, which we didn't know. And that was a lovely revelation of love through the sticks that was reflected. One secondary PGCE student who's going to be an art teacher, who is an art teacher now, was talking about why art had been so important to them during their own teenage years, which then led them to disclose some really important to them information about upbringing and what art had done for them. So some really kind of personal disclosures that came from the students in using this methodology as a tool for internal storytelling and then external explanation. These two were from year 2 students who were on their school placement and had found stuff difficult, both going on in their personal lives and in incidents that took place at school. So quite a kind of, I don't always use the word therapeutic message because I think that can lead to all sorts of discussions, but certainly a message that was allowing them to talk through trauma that had happened to them. And another early years practitioner who had come from Nigeria for her year of study that talked about the hardest thing in my life was saying goodbye to family and friends. And also as part of that group, someone who was finding the writing really difficult. And so they told the story of assignment writing, dissertation writing as part of their story stick. I guess importantly, it was, as Sweetman discusses, these techniques offered a middle ground to reveal and uncover deeper aspects of lived experiences and perceptions. I've just really just want to, for a moment, look at the pictures in greater detail, because really stepping into how we analyze some of this work, it was, I think, a large part of this. And I know that Nicole talks a lot about this in the Embodied Inquiry book, but about immersing ourselves as creative researchers within the gallery of our data. And as an artist and as an artist teacher, I certainly do that. So, you know, I immersed myself, as did the participants, in all of this beautiful artwork that had been produced as a part of the research study. And in doing that, we kind of were immersed in a very sensory way with the colours, the textures, the materials that surrounded us, to see how the stories had come through and were echoing around us. So I do think that sort of immersive moment is so important within the analysis process. And I think analysis is potentially, and I'm very interested to know what people feel about this, is the one area where we do have to do a lot of persuading of people that don't necessarily engage with creative research methods. What I do feel very importantly is that it isn't a case of the stories that emerged from the story sticks and the felt making and textile work. They unfolded and they unraveled from the embodied approach. And I think I've worked with that a long time, because I often work with thematic analysis, which is what we loosely used in order to look at the work that was produced as part of this research. Manet talks about images and narratives belonging to a world that we know about immensely and conventionally, but the connections between them can be clouded by our subjectivities and often remain unrevealed, which is why the visual and textile method was so powerful. There was nothing to read. I was immersed in the listening and the talking and the creativity, which I think was subjective for all of us. And I don't think we should apologise for our subjectivities being a part of creative research methods, because it shows our absolute immersion in the process. But I do think there is a place, perhaps, where creation of images can be followed by opportunities for participants to explain their responses. But I do emphasise the word opportunities. It's still the choice of the participant. However, of all the participants we worked with as part of this project, they all wanted, after making their story sticks, to tell their stories. It was a lovely, powerful prompt, really, for verbal connections. So as I say, it was hard to convey this slide because the stories and consequent themes were huge. So many individuals and so many stories and perspectives. We did loosely use thematic analysis to attempt to group and find commonalities, which we kind of did. But actually for this project, it really wasn't so much what they said. The important findings were much more about the methodology and what we realised it was going to enable us to do into the following year. It was much more about that kind of shared narrative, if you like. But there were kind of, some commonalities, as I say, that we could see going across the student groups: time for reflection and retrospectivity, that ability to tell backstories that are really important to us when we think about our past and our present, time to talk and debrief, an emotional outlet, giving individual and social time for space, time and space, listening, responding to each other, sharing and relational connections. And this last word, which to me was actually really, really important, this understanding of conviviality. The students, though there are a lot of difficult disclosures, they had fun together, they laughed. There was a wonderful sense of human conviviality that was produced as part of this creative and embodied approach. So some of the standouts really were this, I didn't know how to describe it. A student called it an aura. And that actually resonated with an article that I'd read about this idea of the sensory details of the environment, which Pink also talks about. So an effective aura in a safe reciprocal space. And, jumping ahead, the circular and rhythmic motion that was part of all our movements, that encircling, layering and gaining momentum, somehow felt it was all part of that care and sometimes healing process. The fact that perspectives are intrinsically rooted in the material embodied practice, it was deeply multi-layered, and there was a dense self-narration all the way through. Certainly an important sense of agency of everyone that was part of this. And as you would expect from, well, as I always expect now, having done carried out quite a lot of research using visual methods, that unexpected and profound moments for us all that we all shared. Keep jumping ahead, I do apologise. So what became apparent on many of the sticks that were created was these tendrils that came down at the end of the stick, which suggested the story hadn't ended. It was continuing, kind of almost as continuations of hope and tendrils of possibilities. Again, this notion of humour, conviviality, and certainly kindness, as reflected when I talked about the Refugee Education UK. And as an artist, I guess I really loved the fact there was this aesthetic resilience, these beautiful art pieces made by the participants that were forms of embodied resilience in what they'd all experienced and going into the future. So as I said on one of the earlier slides, we ripple now into the future for me, for the people I work with, for the participants. And what I really wanted to do, which I've started to do into this year, is present and develop an understanding of this project with the people that I work with at the university, particularly those quant skeptics that don't necessarily always understand qualitative research and certainly creative research methods. So thinking about how to take these methods into the future, giving time to talk about them and about how you could use them, to look at how to create relational and interpersonal activities where you're using these as tools of agency, and certainly to nurture a research culture where there's empathetic listening and generous thinking, to encourage others to facilitate safe space collaborations that bring together student standpoints, to bring together diverse standpoints. And I'm repeating myself a bit, but to seduce others. So really to try and persuade people, students, staff that I work with, to think about using creative research methods in their embodied creative research methods in their own research projects. And my final slide, well, almost my final slide, is this one, because at the end of the day, the best thing about research really is when you see the impact, I think. And this came from one of my year two students who had gone into school on her school placement at the end of last academic year and had directly taken some of the research tools into her year 4 class, where they talked through some stories. And there were a lot of students with who were with English as an additional language within that school. So she purposely was using it as a connecting communication tool. And that was great to see. And then there's just 2 reference slides, but yes.
Thank you very, very much, Suzy. Thank you so much. And I mean, I'm obviously, unfortunately, not in the room with you, but there is already a virtual round of applause coming from people in the room. It is a really, really fascinating, like talk that you give. I've generally enjoyed listening to you again. I do have some questions, but I also know that some other people have some questions. So I'm going to, rather than me, beginning the questions that I have, I'm going to park those a little bit. If we have time, we can come back to them. But I'd like to begin to say, so we've got one comment that says, this is fascinating to hear. But how did you manage the group dynamic in terms of sharing difficult stories and keeping things anonymous? So that's
Yes.
more to do with the practicalities of actually doing this kind of work in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, actually. I mean, and I guess with the student groups, I knew them. I mean, obviously, what you've got then is power dynamics, as in I'm the tutor and I'm a staff member and they're the students. But I didn't pretend otherwise. I think that's the thing. If you're going to be authentic about it and you're going to be honest about it, then be clear that that's the situation. But none of this was assessed work. So it was very much being part of an exploration of how we use these story sticks. They all had the usual ethical procedures of signing consent forms, so nobody had to take part. It was they volunteered to be part of it, but nobody said no. They all wanted to be. I think they were just really interested in working within the groups. And I totally agree, the sharing of difficult stories. So we had to think very carefully about inevitably, I knew, having used this methodology, that there would be difficult disclosures, that people would share their stories. We chose a very sort of, I guess, quite a nice space to do this in. That does make a difference. I think that's all part of that sensory environment that I was talking about. And nobody had to share their story. And that really was, I made that really clear. Not one person chose, I keep using these negatives, double negatives. Everybody wanted to tell their story. They didn't have to, but they wanted to. That's interesting in itself, they felt safe as a group. So I think there's something to be said about, if you're going to do this, I can't imagine doing it with a group that don't all know each other. That's something for me to work, test out maybe. So they were a familiar group. They felt safe with each other. They felt safe with me. Perhaps that the familial aspect is all part of that methodology.
Thank you.
If,
And I think this is
did you say about the anonymity? Sorry.
Yeah, well, it's about like how do you kind of like keep that tension at bay between people being anonymous and people having to share. But like you said, in these kinds of spaces, if people know each other, it's more about the rapport that you've built than
Yeah.
about sort of like sort of promising anonymity, which you can't really
I
promise anonymity.
No, I mean I keep having these conversations. Obviously, if
Yeah.
when we write up that pseudonyms and no names are
Yeah, that's a
used.
different matter then.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. It's a
There's
difficult thing with visual when products are created, the because of social media, you can put as many clauses as you want in your consent forms and on ethical procedures about ownership and anonymity, but actually at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the participants. If they post pictures of what they've produced, that's out of my hands. That's a big discussion, I think, going on within the visual research community.
There's a sort of some of the question you've kind of already touched upon in what you've said. So there was a question about did the students have the choice to get involved, and you kind of responded to that already. But the question then continues. I'm curious about who this approach worked for, and if there were any who felt excluded by it. Now you did say that everybody wanted to get involved. Everybody actually did share the stories, even if they didn't have to. But do you feel that there would have been like a certain experience of like, oh, everybody else is sharing, so I've got to as well? So is there that element that some of the introverts were perhaps not excluded, but forced to be more extrovert than they would have naturally been, for example?
Well, I suppose that's the thing about telling the story, isn't it? Because actually, as an art process, it was,
Yeah.
although I love collaborative art, this was very individual. And you could be as quiet and as, what's the word I'm looking for? You could do this in your own space. That you
Yes.
didn't have to be extrovert or loud
Yeah.
or vocal about it. And certainly when people start making, a lot of them do just gather their materials, find a space, start to create, and then you hear them quietly talking to a neighbour about what they're creating, and then
Yeah.
it starts to just feel more and more safe. Now, I'm not meaning to sound, I'm saying that in a very general way. I'm not saying that is definitely what's always going to happen. I think
No.
this is a really important question, and it's all, and I use these sorts of questions to think, okay, how do we keep developing this method to
I
take
think
into account?
I think from a personal point of view, from these, I mean, these seminars, I've been holding these for a while now, and I've had these kinds of conversations with a lot of colleagues that are working in this space. And I think there is something about those people amongst us who were trained as teachers. They
Yes.
hold the
Mm.
space somehow differently to somebody who's not trained as a teacher. Because as a teacher, as a trained teacher, whether you're primary or secondary teacher, you do have to learn to hold the space.
Yes,
And
yes.
I think there is something there about that skill that we've learned as teachers that we're bringing into the research environment that many researchers may not have.
I think that's right. And I think also, if I think about working with a group of children or a class of children,
Yeah.
I never persuaded children or made
Mm.
them create. Maybe there'd just be alternatives, and I
Yeah.
haven't had to do that yet with this project,
No,
but that's a
no.
possibility. So, yeah.
Thank you. So there's Gwyneth James who would like to ask a question, which is a little bit of a long one, so it is in the chat box, but I'm bringing Gwyneth in now.
Yeah, hi. I'm just going to unmute. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so Susie, firstly, thank you so much. I This is a question really about evaluative kind of criteria, I guess. So just it was long because I was trying to sort of give a bit of context. So I use narrative inquiry for my research
Mm,
and have done for many years. But I'm really not at all familiar with arts-based or creative approaches like this. And so firstly, I just wanted to say I thought it was really interesting. Thank you so much. Really eye-opening for me because I don't consider myself at all creative in that art sense. So it's a genuine question in terms of curiosity, really. So in narrative inquiry, you have readers and or listeners, I guess, depending on how the narratives have been co-constructed, who can come to the narrative, let's just say it's been written, and they can apply their own interpretation according to how, these narratives are resonating with them. And so
mm.
I'm just wondering for you, assuming, of course, this is a criteria with which you evaluate your research, how resonance works here, because when I looked at the gallery that you had, you know, where you had the different pictures and then you clicked your button and then a quote came and the quote was overlaid. So without the quote, for me, I couldn't make head or tail of it. I loved what I saw, but I couldn't interpret it. And so I just wondered, without any verbal explanation at all, how would people like myself, make sense? Does that make sense to
Yeah,
you?
no, it does. And I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that is part of this analytical approach potentially, which is why I talked about that immersion. Because actually it's different types of analysis maybe. There's no reason why would you know what those pieces of work would say to you, particularly because you weren't contextually involved, if you know what I mean. I mean, then that's my job as the researcher and the participants' job to convey what it is they want to from the data that's produced. But actually, if they hadn't told the story, which they didn't have to, because I think it's quite important to hold on to the non-verbal aspect, then it's the artifact itself. And it wouldn't be that you're analysing the quality or the aesthetic value, but you're looking at the different shapes, the lines, the creation, the embodiment. I guess that's where that comes in, that Nicole would probably be far better at talking about than me. But I think, you know, you're looking for different, what's the word I'm looking for? Different results, different findings that tell different things. Stories are one of them, but actually the way the materials would have been used. And when I talked about the circular, you know, the actual raveling and the circular motion, so the actual activities of that wouldn't have come necessarily from the pictures, that would maybe from a video, and my reflexive diary or journal that I kept all the way through. I'm not sure I'm making much sense here.
No, you are. That's super helpful, actually. Thank you very much, especially to a non-artist like myself.
I do think there is something so strong to be said about immersing yourself in data, whether it's written, whether it's all oral data. But for me as an artist, I know Nicole talk about that in your book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And can I just say, I'm also actually, Gwyneth, I'm not an artist. Well, I wouldn't have defined myself as an artist. But I mean, the question is, what makes an artist? You know, that's a whole philosophical can of worms that we're going to open here. But I would never have thought of myself as an artist, and yet I do that kind of artistic work that Suzy is talking about. So don't be scared. That's you know, just try and see where it takes you, and go with the flow and learn from it. That would be my advice, really.
Absolutely, you do not have to be an artist at all, not for these things. Yeah.
So I've got one person with a question who I would like to bring in. Sanlao, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you so much for the sharing. And I'm just wondering, so is there like any kind of guidance were given to the students before the art making? And was anyone having difficulties during the process? Because like, are they being shown, I mean, I don't know, maybe some kind of examples so they know how to do it? Because I think like to have the colors to represent them, for some people it can be a bit abstract and difficult, or maybe it's because that all the students, like, they are volunteer to join this program, they want to be here, so maybe they are already kind of open or have experienced something similar, so they don't, like, you know, don't have a problem with it.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because although this was an arts-based project, that it was only my BA primary ones that are art specialists. No one else was. So, you know, when we talk about being an artist, well, they all were within this space. On the whole, I'm going to do the first part of I'm just looking at it in the chat. There were I didn't experience any difficulties because it's quite an easy process, actually, from the making point of view. You just have a stick and then you tie things on. But with each, and this was part of the consent process, as each workshop happened, I had the results of the one before. So in fact, I'm always a bit funny. I'm funny about a teacher with art, of showing examples, because the last thing I want to do is for people to copy. I want them to use their own ideas. But actually I did, because what I didn't want is for people to be frightened or worried about producing something beautiful, because that really wasn't part of it. As it happened, they were beautiful, but that wasn't the end goal, if you know what I mean. So yes, I did have previous examples, and the very first group that did it had my examples. So this goes right back to when I did my doctorate. I actually produced a story stick. When I was getting terrified about my viva, I produced a story stick that told the story of my PhD. And I don't know if anyone is out there doing a PhD, but in fact, I took this story stick with me to my viva, which that became the talking point with the examiners, and I had to include it as a photo, as an appendices. And I show the students that, the first group I worked with, I showed them that to show that I had done one. So it kind of, that's how it began, but now I've just got lots of other students' examples, and I don't necessarily tell the stories of those sticks, but they can see there's such a range that have been produced. I hope that answers your
Thank you.
Yeah,
question.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I'm quite aware of the time. I'm going to make sure that we're wrapping up appropriately. So I'm just going to share my screen very, very quickly with some details of the next seminar, which most of you will probably also be interested in, which is called Weaving and Untangling Using Craft and Creative Process as a researcher practitioner across the doctoral journey. So you can see how it somehow relates to the fabric and textiles that Suzy was talking about today, but it's going to be slightly different. And that's Cynthia Kinnunen, and that will take place on the 13th of January 2026. And I have made available the links in the chat accordingly as well. So I'm going to be saying thank you very, very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much, Suzy, for the time that you've taken, for the questions that you've answered. It's been absolutely exciting hour, as always, and I hope to see more of you in the future. And Suzy, I didn't get to ask my questions, so I hope that I can ask them at some other point.
Oh, definitely, please, let's stay in touch. It's very important. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you.